episode 5 of Conversations with Chai. Today, I have with me Sadaf Siddiqui, psychotherapist, and she didn't get her degree from TikTok and just learned the word gaslight to use. A real psychotherapist. You're being on Instagram, so I know everyone sees and reposts your
Do
um,
they?
yeah.
Oh, that's
Like my
exciting.
so like I originally saw you because my cousin's wife actually reposted something. She was going through postpartum, things like
Mm,
that, and then I
mhm.
think she shared something that was, I think, like
Yeah,
probably applicable to what she
I
was feeling.
love when South Asians share mental health content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that you talk about how it's not super open and common in our culture for people to go. But do you think that there's more things that are South Asian specific that require going to therapy or going to mental health services?
Yes and no. I think that emotions are universal, which is a lot of what I talk about on
Mhm.
my platform and also just what I talk about in therapy. And that's also the very interesting thing because even though we might be different, that is the one thing that we all have in common. We all feel sadness, we all feel anger, jealousy, we feel all of those same emotions, but I think that South Asians aren't necessarily willing to talk about those emotions, probably because they didn't hear their parents talking about it when they were a kid. I do think it's changing.
Mhm.
But specifically, I think families, dynamics, boundaries, those are topics that come up a lot among my South Asian clients.
Why do you think that is? Because I've, like, noticed that in, like, generations, like, I, like, see some of my aunts and uncles, and I'm all like, "Oh, like, you are actually, like, depressed, right?" Or, like, "You
Mm,
actually have, like, real anxiety." I look at, like, my own mom, right?
yeah.
And I'm just like, "Oh, like, my mom is, like, an anxious
Mm,
person," right? But, of course, like, they went through the era of it never going, like, diagnosed or having a word. They're just like,
mhm.
"Yo, this is who I am and what I am," right? Like, why is that, do you
And
think?
that's a good question. Well, partially, I don't think we have the language to talk about it, right? I speak Urdu, that's
Mhm.
my native language, and I didn't know that there was a word for anxiety. Actually, I don't know that I still think there's a word for anxiety. So if we don't have the language to be able to communicate how we're feeling, it's already a barrier in being able to share it, right? And then also, if you didn't hear your parents talk about it in a way that if you feel this, here's what you can do, you're going to think, if I feel this, I just have to keep it to myself. It's kind of this like shameful thought that we have that I shouldn't feel like this because no one else is feeling like this. But the truth is, a lot of people are feeling similar emotions to you, but not just willing to talk about it. And not because they don't want to. I think sometimes people do want to talk about it, but they don't really know where to start. They don't know how to say it. They don't know if the other party is going to be able to say, I'm here for you. I'm listening, kind of holding space for that person.
That's interesting. So, like, I have this, like, conversation, like, back and forth with, like, my parents, right?
Mm.
Do you think that, like, we because of, like, the way that our like, maybe because we are more open to having those conversations, do you think then we, like I don't know how to describe it. Like, do we, like, look for those things, right? Because like, I hear, like, a lot of, like, older South Asians talk about, like, "Oh, we didn't have, like, depression and things like that when we were
Mm.
growing up," right? But, of course, like, me and you probably know, like, they probably did.
Me and you know this.
They
Yes.
probably did
Yeah.
have depression and things like that. They just, like, functioned through it, right? Or, like,
Yeah. And
found their own coping through it.
And it's interesting that you say older population, right? Even not even our parents' age, but I think every generation has a different viewpoint on mental health, right? Our parents' generation, they're kind of dismissive about it,
Mhm.
right? And then what is after that? I think it's Gen X.
Like, our generation?
No, like Gen X, then it's millennials, then Gen Z.
Yeah.
But Gen X, I think they had to just be really resilient through a lot of things because they were coming directly from the parents' generation. And then millennials were a little bit more open to kind of pushing the boundaries, but not fully talking about it. And Gen Z, they are having the conversations. So every generation, I think, sees a different level of mental health openness. And I like where it's going.
Mhm.
We still have a lot to do, but I
Yeah.
do like where it's kind of trending.
Like, kind of, like, going into that, like, do you think that, like do when we say that, "Hey, like, we're talking about it more," right? But their counter to that, right, and the counter I've heard is like, "Yo, we still ended up fine."
Yeah, but
Like,
what's fine,
again, I agree, right?
right?
Like, I think that's, like, a perception difference, right? Like, when
Absolutely.
I talk about, like, for example, like, my childhood, right? And then when my parents talk about, like, my
Mhm.
childhood, it's, like, a very different, like,
Yeah,
perception of, like, what happened and, like so, like, their
so
version of
true.
fine,
Right.
right? Like,
Their lens is different.
their lens is
Yeah.
different, right? And I think like even like for me and my sister, like even though we grew up in the same household, her being like 5 years younger, her lens is like
Mhm.
pretty different to like the things that were going on. And like
Yeah.
how do you kind of like navigate that like when you do talk to your clients, right? Like because a lot of it things are our perceptions
Mhm.
of things, right? But is that the only thing that matters when you are going to therapy, or is it?
Perception definitely matters,
Hmm.
right? Because have you ever heard of the phrase victim mentality?
Yes.
Victim mentality is sometimes people are a victim, and
Hmm.
sometimes they have a mentality of being a victim because that's the lens that they're viewing something in, right? So the lens that you're viewing something in, your perspective, it does matter, and usually that perspective is shaped by a lot of other things: what your parents told you, what your community is telling you, what your friends are doing around you. So you're never just like a siloed person. We don't exist in vacuums. We're so like impressionable from other people.
Hmm.
So your perception matters. And then it's also important to think about, okay, where does this perception come from? What part of my perception is based on emotion versus reality? What is based on anxiety? What is based on generational trauma or generational cycles?
How are you differentiating that though, right?
Mhm.
Because like you brought up like the term like victim mentality, right?
Yeah.
And but I think encountered people that I think have a victim
Hmm.
mentality. But obviously like I'm not like licensed really to make that call, right? But
Yeah.
I can like see based off of like or I think I can see based off of behaviors. But how are you differentiating that? Like somebody who is an actual victim? Because like I like sometimes find myself in my therapist's office like did this actually like happen this way or am I just being like over dramatic about it, right? Like how do you
It's a great
validate that,
question.
right?
The fact that you're asking yourself that question is a really important first step. So, victim mentality, it's not a diagnosis, it's not even really a clinical term.
Mhm.
But the way that I would differentiate is really through that question: what is reality and what is your interpretation of that reality? So, for example, your partner doesn't call you back in a long span of time.
Mhm.
Your perception is, oh, they're not that into me,
Mhm.
right? They don't care enough. I'm not that important. Reality could be they were busy, their phone died, they had a lot on their mind, they needed alone time, right? So your perception and your reality are different, but your perception still matters because it indicates how you felt, which is maybe lonely
Mhm.
or misunderstood or whatever it is that you're feeling. So perception matters, reality matters, and the gap between the two is what you can figure out in therapy. I don't think it's for like a regular person, and by regular I mean a non-therapist, to
Mhm.
figure out who is really victim mentality versus not. It's really like a self-awareness question that we should ask ourselves. What is my reality? What is my perception? Um, and then also you have people who are like glasses half full, glasses half empty.
Mhm.
Right. And I think that's a little bit of nurture, a little bit of nature. If your mom, for example, was very pessimistic, negative about certain things, you might have learned to take that same mentality on. But if your mom was someone who was able to, take something and say, this is really terrible and I can do this with it, maybe that's what you grow up learning.
Interesting. Do you think it manifests in like a different way? Because like that kind of like hit a nerve with like me, right? When you
Hmm.
say like, hey, like if your mom was like pessimistic, right? Like you carry like I don't think that I'm pessimistic,
Hmm.
but I do have like I think like some level of like negative self-talk. Like there's like
Okay.
a decent amount of like I would say like confidence and bravado. Like
Got it.
but I do think that some of that but I've never had the thinking that like no I can't like do
Okay.
something, but I've like like I haven't had the feeling, but I've always had like the thoughts,
Yeah.
right?
Well, so what do you do with the thought? Not to put you on the spot.
Like once I have like a negative like
Yeah.
self
Let's say you have a self thought that I can't do this, whatever it is.
sometimes I think I've gone through phases where it's gotten deeper and like deeper and darker
Okay.
where it's like it starts extending to like a lot of things.
Mm,
Like if I like start for example, like when I think I'm like doing great at this, I feel like I'm doing great at all things, right?
mhm.
But then let's say like I'm not doing so hot at this. Like I had a moment on Friday, like a moment of weakness I'm gonna be public about, right? Like I had a moment of weakness where I just didn't feel like the podcast itself was
Mhm,
getting or achieving like the numbers, right? And
mhm.
then I like thought to myself, which again, very rarely, I was like, damn, like who am I to even be having like these conversations or like having this podcast? Like who like you know what I mean? Like is this worth it? Is this dumb for me to do at 26, 27, right? And honestly, like it probably like fried up my day. But like
That's
to
tough.
but like today, like I woke up like like maybe because I was doing it again, I was like, yo, like I'm like fired up, right? So like,
Yeah.
but I don't know, what am I supposed to do with it?
Well, 2 things come to mind.
Okay.
One is that this up and down that you're talking about, where you might have imposter syndrome one day and then be very motivated one day, that's normal. Everyone has that.
Hmm.
Those feelings, those thoughts are not the problem. It's what you do with that that's the problem, right? We do all have moments where we have a negative thought and then it spirals. And like you said, it ate up a lot of your day. But if you have tools to kind of stop yourself when that happens, that can be really effective. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't still process a thought and acknowledge it, right? If you're feeling insecure, it's actually very powerful to say, I'm feeling insecure. I'm feeling like a failure, right? Put a name to what you're feeling and then be able to say, I'm going to get through this moment through whatever tools and either compartmentalize it temporarily or figure out, what else you can do. But suppressing the emotion, I think, is what a lot of people do, and then that gets them in trouble.
I'm sorry, listeners. I'm about to turn this into like a personal like therapy session with Sadaf, right?
Well, your situation is so relatable. So many people have those same feelings.
I would say like, okay, so like my question there, right, is like you're saying like, hey, like you have it's normal to have these feelings and then like work through them, right? But
Mhm.
then what do we do, or like what do people who feel like these things repetitively, like
Yeah.
repetitively to a point where almost is like a detriment to like their day to day or their week to week, right? Because I think like even like amongst like my friends, right, like there's phases and eras where like we feel like we're on top of the world, but then there's also phases and eras, right, where like we wash away our
Mhm.
like two. I had like my like best friend was like, yo, like I feel like I haven't like progressed in the last 2 years, and it really bothered me because I was like, yo, like I like live with the guy, and I'm just like, yo, I've seen all the progress in your like life, right? Like, how can you think it's just
As an
like, yo,
outsider.
sometimes I can like, sometimes I get these like thoughts and then it just like extends on, right? So like, how, like, what do we do for people who feel these things like recurringly?
Excellent question. And I can talk about this for hours. So I'm going to try to be succinct.
Okay.
The first thing is this is kind of what you were saying earlier about this whole, oh, is the podcast getting enough views? Is it really doing what I wanted to do? The thing is this, are you attached to the process or the outcome? A lot of people get attached to the outcome. And when it becomes too overly focused on that, you lose sight of the reason you were doing it in the first place, especially with something that's like a passion project,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a passion project that you're kind of doing on your own, obviously with help, but it's something that you are very much attached to because if it's successful, you're like, it's because of me. If it's not successful, it's because of me.
Mm-hmm.
But you always have to remember your why. I often come back to my why when things get tough in whatever, even my business. I like remind myself, well, why am I doing this? And for some people, it's passion. For some people, it's financials. Whatever it is, don't be shamed by your why. Just trust in your why and constantly evaluate what is my why? Are my values changing? Am I growing? Is my why changing? So that's the first thing. Second is normalizing the up and down patterns. I've never seen anyone's journey that hasn't had up and down moments of regret, moments of doubt. That's a very normal process for almost everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard How I Built This with Guy Raz?
Yes. Like
The
yes,
podcast.
yeah.
I've listened to a lot of episodes and I haven't listened to one where they didn't talk about being at a like complete loss or really saying like am I doing the right thing, not feeling supported, that is a normal part of the process. And even though it does get us down in the moment, if we're kind of thinking about the bigger picture and recognizing that one like moment of weakness as not a failure but just as a stepping stone, right? Because you have some stepping stones that are clear, some that are like rocks, and some that are like sharp, pointy edges, but
Mm-hmm.
you're just finding ways to kind of get past them. And then, the other thing is that you mentioned that really resonated with me is when you said, well, I like talk to someone. Or maybe you were saying someone talked to
Yeah,
you
yeah,
and the other person was able to say, but you have
yeah.
done
Mm-hmm.
all of this. So having that social support is so important because someone is able to see things objectively. We are not always objective observers of our own life, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're we're emotional beings, which is great because emotions are great, not meant to be hidden or whatever. So if you can create a community, a source of support, that's a really, really big tool for getting through those moments.
Because some of it alters definitely your reality, right? Some of your perceptions are based off of the perceptions of those around you, right? Like if
Yeah.
everyone around you is saying like, "Yo, everything is popping and things are fly right now," you're gonna be like, everything is flying, things are popping right now, right? But if everyone around you is like, I like notice this like again,
Mhm.
like I've noticed this a lot this week, right? I like try to be like a pretty like positive person just in my day to day, but of course, like with everything like going around, like going on right now with like Palestine, right?
Yeah.
Like I see, like it's crazy. By the end of the week, I like told my like, and this is such a cop out. Like I like tried to like ignore, not ignore it, but like basically like shield myself from like
Mhm.
social media.
Mhm.
And then my roommate and I like had a conversation about it on Tuesday, and then my entire feed ends up being like, and I go back on social media to go, and I'm just like, and like I started feeling like, oh, like the world is actually like in a terrible place, which, you know,
Mhm.
maybe it is, but
Mhm.
you start like getting altered by the voices and the people around you. And then I had to like recenter myself around like my friends and my family and be like, oh, like there's still like happy moments in
Mhm.
this world, right? Because I think scrolling through it like really just feels like pure despair. And like
Right.
you kind of start like eating at like the public consciousness a little bit.
Absolutely. And we're at the place where we have information so accessible, not even accessible, but like kind of in our face. Because even if we're taking a social media break, but a friend texts you like a post
Hmm.
or someone's story, it's like even if you're trying to minimize it, other people can still get it, you know? So we're just like that social media break that you said, just kind of stepping away, grounding yourself. That is so important. But sadly, I think a lot of people don't know how to ground themselves.
When when
We're
you say
dysregulated.
when you say ground yourself, right? Like, how do you like? What is like the process for that, right? Like, if you're a listener or somebody, right?
Mhm.
Like, and you like, what is your grounding process?
Yeah. So I think grounding is different for everyone. Some
Hmm.
people are very into nature, some people are into music, some people are into yoga, meditation, talking to others, right? There's so many ways to ground yourself, but really when I think about grounding yourself in a healthy constructive way, I think about tuning the outside world out and tuning into your own thoughts, which is very hard because our thoughts are intrusive sometimes. And intrusive means that we have so many at one time, and I know this personally too, not just professionally, because I have tried to meditate for like 10 years straight. And up until the last 2 years, I wasn't able to do it. It took almost 10 years for me to get to a place where I can say, okay, if I have thoughts, it's okay. And if I don't have thoughts, if I don't have thoughts, sometimes the silence is too loud. So my thinking is always like, how do you get to a point where you can really tune into yourself? And the way to answer that question is to really think about, what makes you feel safe, what makes you feel relaxed, what makes you feel comforted. um, Also time with other people, that's
Hmm.
a thing that a lot of people don't think is a grounding ritual, but it can be a morning phone call with a friend. I have friends where every 2 weeks we have a setup call, so I always know that it's coming. If something's on my mind, I always know there's an outlet coming.
Yeah.
But not having like a light at the end of the tunnel when you're going through something or feeling alone, easiest way to feel disconnected, dysregulated, and like no matter what you do, you won't be able to ground yourself.
I think like that I'm like glad that you said that, right? Because I've always felt that way. That like my version of like grounding and therapy, right, is really
Mm,
talking to people who I can really
yeah.
converse with, right? Because I like came in like I feel like even though like I started going to therapy probably like more like consistently this year,
Uh-huh.
I was like, yo, I feel like I've been going to therapy like the last 2 years, like living with like my
Mhm.
roommate who's like somebody who like
Yeah.
I just like know really well.
Mhm.
Like it's like my best friend, right? Like we understand each other and he like knows so much of like my background and history that like it's really good to have those conversations and like I say all of my
Yeah.
intrusive thoughts to him because I know it's like a judgment free zone. I know like
Yeah.
he's not going to look at me a
Mhm.
certain way and like he's able to like challenge some of those thoughts. But when you say like tune into your thoughts, right?
Mhm.
And I've been fearful of that in the past of like
Mhm.
almost avoiding that,
Mhm.
and I have friends and family that avoid being by themselves because of those those thought trains,
Yeah.
right? Like people who just say like, "Oh, all I have is like negative thoughts,"
Yeah,
right?
and that's a very hard place to be. And sometimes you have negative thoughts because you have deep rooted organic anxiety or depression. And both of those conditions can be organic, as in biological in nature, right? Sometimes anxiety is situational and it makes sense, right? Like everything we see in the news, very anxiety provoking.
Mhm.
It makes sense if someone were to come to me and say, I'm feeling anxious when I read about this. But if someone has constant anxiety, there is something more to that then, right? If it's not just situational. So one is kind of figuring out, well, what is the root cause of this? How long have I had this? Those are really hard questions to ask. And then I would say really take your inner dialogue from a place of moving away from a place of shame into a place of compassion. So for example, if you had a friend or a roommate that came to you and said, I'm having these dark thoughts, what are the chances that you're going to be like, you're an idiot? What's wrong with you? Why are you having those thoughts?
Mhm.
You're going to be supportive and say, man, I'm so sorry. I have no idea if you say man,
Mhm.
but I'm so sorry. What can I do? How long has this been going on? Or, just being there for that person. But how often are you that person for yourself?
Yeah. Like, I think so a couple things that I kinda wanna, like, volley back to you. I think, like, those people and I've had those people are super valuable, but
Mhm.
what happens when I then, like, step away, right? Because how much of it is, "Hey, like, this person helps me regulate," and
Mhm.
how much of it is, "I can regulate in situation," right? Or
Like
in process,
codependency, like how much are you counting on them to regulate you?
like, counting on it, but, like, also, like, I feel like I have, like, trigger like, I have my therapist told me, she's like, "Yo, what are you angry at?" Right? Like, so
It's a
or what
great
is your inner
question.
or what is your, like, 15-year-old you? Like, what were you angry at, right? And I honestly, like, didn't have a good answer, but
Mhm.
I've noticed that, like, some of that anger, even though, like, I feel like I've, like, zenned out in, like,
Mhm.
life, right, since a 15-year-old, hopefully, I mean, that's the goal, right? But I feel like I I've had moments where, like, hey, something triggers me, I get back into that like anger or whatever,
Mhm.
and like I have like friends that like walk me back, right? But I've
Yeah.
also had moments where like, hey, like they're not around or they're not immediately there to check me.
Mhm.
So then the anger actually has some sort of result or outcome from it, right? That usually ends up burning me in some way, right?
Got it.
So like so the question for you, I guess, is like how do I work on that as like an individual, right? Like not relying or like how do I regulate that in
Mhm.
in moment?
That is the basis of my work with young adults. It
Okay.
all comes down to two things: distress tolerance and emotional regulation. So, distress tolerance is pretty much what it sounds like, your ability to cope and deal with stressors as they come, because no life is without stressors, right?
Mhm.
Of course, some people have a high level of stressors and some people have slightly less, but every single person has stress. And everyone's going to be in a situation where they feel extremely triggered. They feel reactive, they feel hurt, and the next step from that is emotional regulation. So when you feel triggered, you become dysregulated and you can either have an outlet of your friends. And when that's not available, that's when you come back to yourself and say, I can soothe myself. That ability to self soothe, powerful, life changing, takes years to learn how to do,
Mhm.
to the point where it becomes natural, right? So the first time that like a client of mine is sitting in session and trying to self-soothe, it's so painful to watch because they can't do it. If it's someone that's never practiced. And then after a lot of practice, and not just in therapy, right? Like a lot of my clients will be given homework where they're supposed to practice some of the tools that we talk about outside of the session so they can learn to be independent with it. But the more they practice, a few months later they come back and they're saying, this happened, or I got in a fight with my boyfriend or my mom, and I didn't just react. I paused, I identified what I was feeling, I did these self-soothing skills, and then afterwards I was deliberately able to like respond with what I really thought was the right thing to do, and that made me not regret things. And that is so incredible to watch yourself go through that, but it happens slowly, right? And so I do a lot of like tracking of behaviors with my clients,
Mhm.
and so I'm able to say, oh, well, 3 months ago, you got into the same fight, because a lot of fights are cyclical. And this is how you reacted. Now look at what you're doing. Small changes, right? Nothing is going to happen in like a small amount of time because most people are unlearning behaviors that they've had for years. I work mostly with Gen Z and millennials, right? So we're talking like 20, 30 years of behaviors that they've been relying on. They're like undoing, but the change is so amazing to see.
Interesting. So yeah, I want to tap into something you said, right? You said a lot of arguments or fights are cyclical, right?
Yeah.
Why is that? I kind of have
Because
an idea, but like why is
yeah,
that?
so the research actually shows that a lot of problems, especially in relationships, romantic relationships, they are problems that cannot be solved. And so what we do then in couples therapy is we say, what is the underlying message or feeling that you have behind the fight? So if the fight is my boyfriend doesn't text me goodnight, right? And
Mhm.
that's like, and the boyfriend is trying, or the girlfriend,
Mhm.
doesn't matter who, and the other person is like trying to do it, they don't remember, and it's a constant fight. Well,
Mhm.
let's get back to, okay, what happens inside of your body and in your mind when they don't do that? Are you worried for their safety? Are you feeling like no one cares about you? And we figure out what is really the root cause of that, and then we say, okay, if this person can't deliver this one need to you, right? Because everyone cannot meet your needs
Yeah. Or all your
or
needs.
all your needs, right?
Yeah.
And so we say, okay, what else can they do that would help meet this need, at least partially? And what can you do for yourself that would help meet the need? So, in that very simple example, it's like if you are waiting for this goodbye text or
Mhm.
goodnight text from your boyfriend or girlfriend, initiate it. I'm heading to bed soon, would love to hear from you. Or, I'm going to bed, good night, right? And make it a habit so then the other person also can learn from modeling, right? And then figure out, is this a core need or is this a need that I can compromise on? Can you talk
Interest
to a friend instead and say good night with them?
do couples therapies?
I do, yeah.
Okay, question for you, right? Just because we were talking about this now. So so obviously, like you talked about a specific issue, right, and a
Hmm.
specific fight, and people working through it, right? What where or do you even have this belief of
Hmm.
like your clients, right? Where can you say like, hey, you guys just aren't meant for each other, or hey, you guys can actually work this out?
Yeah.
Because sometimes I see like relationships, and I'm just like,
You're like, oh,
I'm all like, yo, that's crazy that
uh-huh.
she like just talked to you like that or she just said that,
Yeah.
right? But I also have seen, like even the most greatest of relationships in my life, I've also seen them have disagreements, right?
Hmm.
So I can't say like, oh, just because you had a fight or disagreement
Love is blind.
that y'all not meant to be together, right? So how do you kind of make that
Yeah.
call or how do you observe that?
Right. I think that even if people aren't in a relationship, I think like watching shows like Love and Blind, they really highlight that, every couple just goes through. I mean, actually, that's like a weird show. It's not like an average relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
So your question is, how do I know if a couple is gonna make it or not? Or
I would say,
when is
or
the
should
line?
they make it or not? Because I see people that probably
Yeah.
shouldn't be together, ended up married, now they're just together. I think growing up in South Asian households, most of us have seen that.
Right. So actually, there's a lot of research behind couples that make it versus couples that don't. So there's these two psychologists who are amazing, Julie and John Gottman, and they actually have done research, science-based research on relationships. And one of the psychologists said he can predict with a very high accuracy. I want to say like over 80%, 80 or 90%, if a couple is going to make it or not within the first few minutes of watching them interact. And it's wild. But the reason he can do that is because he looks at a couple of factors. For example, contempt is the biggest relationship killer. It's one of the biggest reasons couples end up being divorced. And contempt is really just when one partner acts like they are better than the other partner in some capacity. It looks different for everyone. It could be,
Mhm.
making fun of them in a very rude, mocking way. It could be acting like they're not equal. There's so many things under contempt, but that's the number one predictor of divorce. So, psychologists, of course, have behaviors that they're looking out for when they're in a session to kind of figure out what it is. And when I work with couples, the first thing I do is I just kind of do a baseline assessment of where are you guys in the relationship. So, for example, I recently started working with a new couple and they were like together for a little bit, they broke up, and the guy was in a relationship with someone and they were still trying to make it work. And I said, you can't I can't help you be in a relationship with someone who's already in a relationship. They're already unavailable, right? We're not even talking about emotional unavailability.
Mhm.
They're just like physically unavailable to you,
Yeah.
right? So like and it's funny, I've actually never seen that before. Like someone coming in already having someone that they're talking to or dating and then coming in with someone that they want to be with, right? So we see all kinds of things. And now it's been a few weeks, they're together. They're fully together, working through a lot of things as in the couple that I work with.
Mhm.
And they're figuring out their communication, their needs, and all of that. So I say that I don't ever go in with the idea that this couple won't make it unless there's toxic behaviors, abuse, like physical abuse is, a
Yeah.
hard no. And I always have individual sessions with them to kind of assess where are you right now. And then it comes down to goals and values. If one partner's like, I definitely don't want kids, and the other partner's like, I want kids, it's not that they can't be together. It's just they have to figure out, do my values align with the values of this person?
Okay. Just stop here and like a little bit deeper, right, into that part, right? The values, right? You don't or do you how do you differentiate people who like, hey, their values actually
Mhm.
align or hey, I just want a relationship or hey, I just want to be married? Because I think I see that phenomenon a lot too, right? I think
Right.
especially like South Asian like women who have more of that pressure once
Mhm.
they reach like 27, 30. Like we've all heard like the stories. And again, those
Yeah.
people might be happy in those, right? Like, but I
Right.
see a lot of South Asian women at like 27, 28 who said like,
Mhm.
yo, I'd never date this, and this type of guy. And then they end up marrying that type of guy, right? And of course, some of it is like, hey, your tastes
Mhm.
or preferences or you might have changed,
Mhm.
but how much of it is also like, hey, I'm just gonna whatever boxes you don't fill, I'm
Mhm.
just gonna be like, all right with it, and then
Mhm.
just so I can get married, and then we see the issues of that
Yeah.
months, years,
Absolutely.
decades down the line.
It happens a lot, and I think it
Yeah.
happens a lot in South Asian cultures because I think South Asian people aren't necessarily having the difficult conversations beforehand.
Mhm.
I think it's changing a little bit, but I don't think all of them are having those difficult conversations. And so when in their first or second year of marriage, all of those issues come out, they're not sure how to navigate those. But that doesn't mean that they're doomed, right? You can still have those difficult conversations later. And I'm never going to tell a couple, no, you're not going to work. Right. That's just not my stance. It's actually not the stance of most couples therapists until we get information
Mhm.
and I because my graduate program was so research and science based, I think I always like go in that direction
Mhm.
where I always say like, dating is yes, it's dating and it's fun, but it's also data gathering, right? You're not necessarily making a decision yes or no. You're collecting information, not only on the other person, but yourself. How do I feel when I'm in the room with them? How do they make me feel? And what emotions do they bring out in me? And how am I showing up in the relationship? Right. And it's very difficult to be in the other seat in like a one on one with a couples client and saying, hey, you're mad at your partner for this. You feel really hurt. How did you contribute? And it's not to blame or to attack, but it's kind of like, did you not set enough clear boundaries? Did you not share your expectations? Right? So there are all these things that we do to figure out where is your starting point? Where do you want to be? And then one thing that I always do with my clients, especially my couples clients, but all my clients, is a needs assessment. We figure out what are your needs in a relationship. And then people always list like 50 needs. And then we filter through them and we say, what are your core needs? Those are the things that are non-negotiable. You must have them. And then we say, what are your wants? And the reason we differentiate between core needs, non negotiables, and wants is because wants are flexible and you can compromise on them. But if you choose to be in a relationship with someone who cannot meet your core needs, you're going to have those perpetual fights that have no solution, that are cyclical, the ones we talked about earlier.
So again, like I think I've seen a lot of people like live adjust even like that core need part, right? Like people who say like, "Hey, I needed X,
Yeah.
Y, and Z," and then that person like had to either provide that and adjust
Hmm.
that. So like I understand like the stance that of course that you're taking like,
Hmm.
"Hey, I don't want to say that they're doomed," but you don't but you don't think that like some level of it like it's going to create some level of like unhappiness long term for one of them, right? Like either hey, like I don't know what I'm making up, right? But like, hey, I want my man to have X, Y, and Z, and man
Yeah.
goes and gets X, Y, and Z for that person, but they don't really want X, Y, and
Hmm.
Z, right? You don't think that that man is just going to be at some level like
Resentful.
resentful?
Absolutely. But couples evolve, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you know at one time is not necessarily what you know another time. And I always say that couples can evolve and you have to evolve with your partner in a healthy relationship. And that doesn't mean that there's going to be times that two people are not evolving in the same direction. It's very possible because you have two different individuals,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have two independent thinkers, unless you're in a codependent relationship, but you have two people with different wants, likes, needs. And I think generally values are what bring you together, but if you have different interests and goals, you are going to hit roadblocks where you're different. I don't think that necessarily means you're doomed. I know you really want me to say, yes, some couples are doomed, but I don't think that necessarily means you're doomed. I think it comes down to, okay, can you communicate about it? Can you compromise? And to your point earlier about what if there are core needs that you do compromise on, and I interpreted that as are you settling,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think core needs, even though they're non negotiable, they can still have a little bit of a compromise in them. For example, if there's a core need that you have, maybe that core need isn't going to come from your partner. Maybe it's going to come from you having a social circle. Maybe it's going to come from a passion, a hobby, family, having a pet, a business. The thing is, a lot of people get in trouble in a relationship when they put all of their core needs onto one person. You must be my friend, you must be my therapist, you must be my like lover, you must be my mentor, and that's a lot for one person.
But then what do you say to the person who's like, "Yo, I can and I want to have it all." You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, well,
Like the
hopefully
person
they're in
who's like,
therapy.
huh?
Hopefully that person's in therapy and they're able to figure out that that's not a reality and just not for them. Like the other way too, right? So I think that's how I would help shift the perspective. If your partner relied on you for everything, maybe there's a part of you that feels very happy to be needed and maybe it's your
Mhm.
way of showing love because acts of service could be your love language. Right.
Yeah.
And so doing things could be like something that really makes you feel fulfilled. But if you do it for a long amount of time, you're going to get burnt out. And if someone isn't able to hear that, which happens a lot, they feel it later. And the thing about stress in relationships is that it eventually begins to impact your body. And there's a lot of research behind people having physical symptoms manifesting from unhealthy relationship dynamics over time because that kind of stress literally shows up through backaches, gut issues, migraines, all of that stuff. So if it doesn't show up right away, it will show up later. And that's always the saddest part.
That's super interesting. So like talk about that, right? A little bit. So like when you say like it's actually the stress physically making somebody sick,
Yeah, stress can make you physically sick.
it's just I feel like we hear that all the time,
Yeah.
right? Like, hey, like you're stressed out, migraine, stressed out, like whatever. But you're
Mhm.
talking about like even like other physical issues like gut health
Well,
and
yeah, and the thing is, a lot of stuff is the start of something. So, if you have gut health issues, right? If you're already susceptible to something and you have a lot of relationship stress that gives you anxiety, there's a direct link with your gut to your mind. A direct link. Like there's literally a nerve in your body
mhm.
that goes from your brain to your gut. And the messages travel back and forth. So, when you're anxious, you might get a stomach ache because or before a presentation you might be a little bit like, your stomach might hurt, you might like feel a little bit butterflies. That's literally your brain communicating with your gut. So so gut issues are not going to necessarily be the cause of like cancer, for
Mhm.
example. So you can't say like relationship stress causes cancer.
Cancer.
But gut health issues make you more susceptible to other things. You're not digesting your food properly, and if you're not digesting your food properly, maybe you're eating less. You're eating less, you're more hangry. You're more hangry, you're probably getting in more fights. You're not getting enough sleep, right? It's so much is connected.
Well, I think we see that like in people probably around us, right? Like people who were probably at one
Absolutely.
point shining, and I think that's like one of the saddest things to like
Mhm.
see in people, people who have like a shine to them or whatever, right? And then you see that shine like slowly, slowly, like being almost like chiseled away by
Yeah.
the weight of the. So like when you say like no couple is doomed, right? I would again bring you back like those.
You
Again,
really
I'm not
want me
trying
to
to.
say it.
I don't even know like, but I want to bring back like those examples, right? Because I see that a lot, and I think like a little bit more like I don't know how to describe
I'll
it. I think
rephrase after you're done.
yeah, I think I'm like more like passionate about it because I've seen so many poor
Yeah.
couples like growing up, especially that
Mhm.
I'm just like some of y'all just shouldn't have been together, or
Yeah.
maybe your perspective is like, hey, they should have done the work, and because they
No,
didn't
I
want to
mean,
do the work,
it's true.
like,
Some people don't belong together,
mm-hmm,
right? Some people don't belong together. This is not me as a therapist speaking. This is me as a human speaking. I don't
mm-hmm,
believe in soulmates. I believe that lots of different people can be right for you, right? And I think that love is definitely a feeling, but love is also choice. You choose the person that you know is going to be good for you. It's going to be good for your nervous system. It's going to be aligned with your values. And of course, you want to also love the person, right? I'm not saying go on a checklist and ignore love. You
mm-hmm,
need love, but love is not enough. So what I think you're saying is two people that might have chemistry, but then they're just not compatible. Right.
mm-hmm, yeah.
And that's possible. That's why in couples therapy, we do needs assessment. We figure out values. We do all of these things to figure out are you compatible? And some people might think they're not compatible, but the real issue is that they don't have good communication skills. So that's why I don't go in with the stance that the couple is doomed until I figure out what is the issue.
Do you for in your couples therapy practice, are you getting mostly people like in like early stages of relationships, or are you getting people like, yo, we've been together like 5 years, we're on the brink of like calling this shit quits?
Yeah,
It-
all kinds.
all kinds.
Yeah. So I work primarily with young adults. I work with both men and women, and I'll sometimes have like a client and they'll be like, I want to bring in my partner. And then sometimes I'll have a couple, like the couple I just told you, they're not even together. one person is dating someone else, but they're in couples therapy. And I love it. I love it because maybe that means they're trying to figure out if they want to be together. Obviously, they both have to be available, but I see people in all stages. And really, there isn't necessarily a wrong or right time to start couples therapy. I really recommend if you are like getting serious with someone and things are going well, but you're like taking the next step and you're having some concerns, maybe start with individual and then, start with couples if you need it. But you don't have to be in a crisis to seek couples
Therapy.
therapy.
And I think that's true for even regular therapy, right? Like I think
Yeah.
a lot of us look for it was funny, like my therapist asked like why did you come in, right? And I was like, honestly, like I scheduled it like a month in advance, right? Cuz my first ever session
Hmm.
with the specific therapist and she was like, "Why did you come in?" I was like, "Honestly, when I scheduled it, shit was going terrible." Right? And then I almost considered canceling it because by the time the
Hmm.
appointment came up, I'm fine, right?
Yeah.
So I was just like, "There's nothing," and she's like,
Hmm.
"Honestly, it's been super helpful not
Yeah.
having things go like." I think the most productive sessions are when things are actually going fine, and I have time to like uncover
Uh huh.
like other things from my like past, right?
Yeah.
Rather than like, oh, like this person like pissed me off and like we went at it, right? Of course, those like also lead to those types of
Absolutely.
conversations. So uh,
Well, I'm really proud of you for not only going to therapy, but being open about it on this, on this podcast.
I again, right? Like, and that's a big reason. Like, I wanted you on specifically, and you on like as in general, right? Because I think like, and maybe I'm like, I feel a little bit more passionate about it being like a South Asian like male. Like, I think a lot of us grew up
Absolutely.
with not like we grew up with like fathers that probably didn't express emotion in like the
Hmm.
healthiest way, or even like like whatever our parents in general, right?
Moms are
Like
like, here's food. This is how you know I love you.
yeah, right. And I think like I think people are gonna kill me unless I ask you these like questions, right? Like there are parts of like South Asian like tropes that I think like
Hmm.
I kind of want to ask you from like your perspective, right? One being that like the brown son and like mother like relationship and how that impacts. Because my friends actually phrased this question. They were like, "Hey, like we want you to ask why all brown guys are the three types of the same three types of fucked up."
Wait,
And
what are those three types?
emotionally unavailable, cheaters, or mama's boys, or however,
Yeah.
however those things manifest in each
Hmm.
individual person, right? But like a lot of like my friends that do like primarily date like
Yeah.
brown men, right, are like, yo, they all kind of have the same maybe that's just all men in general. They all got the same like red flags. They all have the same like what do you think that there are things in South Asian culture that cause these things to be like cycled? Because I know a lot of brown guys who have very hard times expressing emotion, very hard times
Mhm.
being honest about what they want, right? Like,
Absolutely. So I do work with a lot of South Asian men.
mhm.
And again, all of them are young adults. So I'm like catching them at a good time. And they struggle, right? Like maybe if someone saw them in the outside world, people would be like they're emotionally unavailable. And maybe they are. But in therapy, they're really able to kind of open up and talk about why certain things in their mind are, right? And yes, I do think that a lot of South Asians traditionally are definitely coddled. Even my clients will say that.
Mhm.
And they have, these strong relationships with their moms, but then that equals something else. And on another podcast, I recently shared that I like saw this meme on Instagram that said like if you've ever dated girls, if you've ever dated a South Asian guy, you can add nanny to your resume.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's definitely offensive, but also like that exists for a reason, right? I think that there is this stereotype that men want this, but also if you've only ever known something, you just kind of seek it, right? It's like the dangers of not being self-aware enough to think what are the things that I need to change. But there always is, like a developmental history related to it. So I actually don't think a lot of people know this about me, but I'm a child therapist by training. And my work currently in my practice lies at the intersection of the way that we develop as kids and how that development impacts the way we show up as adults. And so much of South Asian men development, I think, or so much of the behaviors that you just talked about, I think is rooted in that child development. But that doesn't necessarily excuse it, right?
Agreed, right?
So, self awareness and hearing other South Asian men say, I go to therapy because I want to show up better for my partner. I want to feel fulfilled. I want to have better skills. That's the kind of inspiration I think we need, which is why I'm so proud of you for being able to talk about it. Um, but also, to the other point, I work with a lot of South Asian females who fit into those categories.
Fit
right?
into which
The 3
categories?
ones that you said. I mean, not the mamas
Oh,
boy,
like
of course.
their own like levels of red flags,
Yeah,
right?
but I think that, so yeah, I work with people who literally have self-identified as I'm emotionally unavailable, I have cheated, men and women.
Mhm.
And it's, really comes it's the same work that I do with them, but obviously the developmental trajectory is different for a South Asian girl versus a South Asian guy.
Yeah. So, how do you as a, psychotherapist, like, how do you, like, look at cheating? Like, how do you, like, how do you try is there a singular root cause why all people cheat? Is there, like, something that happens developmentally, right? Because like, openly and honestly, like, yo, like, I've been, like, a cheater
Mhm.
in the past,
Mhm.
right? And, like, that's, like, not me, like, you're just putting on, like, wax, right? But that's, like,
Mhm.
something that, like, I've had to, like, try and, like, work through, and I don't think I've
Yeah.
identified, like, the
Mhm.
why. Like, I think the why I've made up in my head is like, yo, I've never seen like a great relationship,
Mm.
right? Like I tell my cousins that are married, like they got married like recently. I'm all like,
Mhm.
yo, y'all are like the only relationship I saw that I was like, yo, I want that,
Mm.
right?
That's sweet.
But like that happened obviously like much later in my like life, right? So like how do you like if somebody says like, hey, like I cheated, right? Like how do you try to like root cause that?
Well, I know this is probably controversial for anyone who's like experienced cheating on the other end, like someone who's been cheated on,
Mm-hmm.
but I really try not to shame my clients because I would say like 99% of the ones that come in and they're saying, I did this, they feel guilty. They feel embarrassed and they're full of shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my job as a therapist is this like unconditional positive regard. And it's not always easy to have, but that basically means that I see my client as a human above anything else. I don't see them as a cheater. I don't put them in these categories of you're a cheater, you're this. I mean, like personally, I probably would struggle if someone was like, I hurt a kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's probably where I'd have to like work on myself. But aside from very, intense things like that, I don't categorize my clients. And because of that, I can come in and not really do it through a place of judgment. And when you talk to someone, not from a place of judgment, it's crazy how much they open up to you. And it's wild how much comes out, right? Because they can finally let their guard down. And South Asian people in general, and more men in my practice versus women have a big like problem with being vulnerable because they never ever witness their moms or dads being vulnerable, right? And vulnerability here means like opening up about your struggles, right? A lot of like parents will say, I had to do this when I was a kid and I didn't complain. And I always think like you should have complained.
Yeah.
You should have talked about how hard it was for you. You can say, "This is hard for me, and I know I have to do it." Right? But they weren't taught that. So it's like not it's an unreasonable almost like thing in my mind for us to put that on our parents' generation because they thought if you complained, like it was going to be weakness. But more than that, if they complained, I think probably internally they may have fallen apart because they had to compartmentalize to get through a lot. Right? I'm talking especially for immigrant parents.
I think like the conversations that we get to have now, right? Like I look at it as like a point of like exactly what you're saying. I look at it as like a point of like luxury, right? Like
Yeah.
my dad did not have time to like sit and be like, why are these things like gapped out about me? Like why do I have these gaps
Yeah.
in my like life, right? Like because he had to like, yo, I need to like make sure there's a roof overhead. I
Yeah.
need to make sure things are in place, right? Whereas like I get to like sit around and like
Mhm.
like the whole like our
Well, you're not
generation,
just
like
sitting
we get to
around.
like sit around and like find ourselves, right? Which I know it's not sitting around, right?
Right.
But for that, like
It's a
that's how it was
luxury,
like always like
privilege.
framed, right? And sometimes I have to like remind myself, like, yo, no, this is like the work that's like kind of needed for me, right? For
Mhm.
me to like long term, like, yeah,
Yeah,
they were able to be
absolutely.
functionable, right? But there's also like a lot of impacts and consequences of them not dealing with certain things, right? That I'm like, yo, like I'm just gonna repeat it. I
Yeah.
think like we were talking about it earlier. I see a lot of repetition, and I'm sure like you see this
Mhm.
like a lot in your practice. I see a lot of like, like patterns in like my dad
Mhm.
that I just am now. I'm just
Yeah.
like a reiterated version. Like I was joking around with my therapist. I was like, damn, growing up, my dad was like, I used to always like look at like my dad like working like 7 days a week and like having like one job, then having a
Yeah.
newspaper and doing all of that. And then my therapist is like, yo, that sounds just like you.
Mm.
And I was like, "Oh shit!"
How was that for you to hear?
I kind of always like saw it.
Yeah.
Like I've like noticed like some of those
But it's
patterns
different when
before.
it's, like, said out loud,
Yeah,
right?
for sure, right?
Yeah.
And then like then her question is like, why do you think that is, right?
Mhm.
And that's probably like, the more uncomfortable conversation
Yeah.
that I'm probably not 100% there to have, right? Like she asked me a question and I would ask you this, right? Like, or
Mhm.
I'm sure you've probably had people, she's like, what did 15-year-old or 10-year-old need? Like,
Yeah.
what did your 15-year-old self, like, if you could go back and tell yourself one, like something, what
Yeah.
would it be?
Are you asking me?
What would yours be?
For me, it would be validation for sure. For
Yeah.
sure, because I am the middle child and my siblings make fun of me for this all the time and now we laugh about it, but they're like, "You definitely have middle child syndrome." I
Hmm.
was always the mediator, the peacemaker, and in being that, like, or taking on that identity, I think like my need for validation and reassurance wasn't always met. And like sometimes my siblings will joke and be like, "Happy National Middle Child's Day." And if they don't, I'll be like, "Hey, you guys didn't wish me happy National Middle Child's Day." And they'll be like, "Yeah, that's how we know you're a middle child." But I think that was it for me. I didn't get it. And now my friends who validate me, I feel so much more connected to them because I feel seen.
Do you like because she asked me that, right? And I'm like now thinking about it, I feel like I know what I was gonna say, but I'm still like, this was just like the most recent therapy session.
Uh-huh.
So I'm still thinking about it in my head. Do you think that like when I identify that thing, right? Like for you it's
Mhm.
validation, right? Is like does that just help you in like all of your friendships and relationships to say, hey, I need this? Or is it
Yeah.
or did it help you be like, hey, I know this? So like,
Mhm.
because I find myself, and I think like the one that I think what I'm gonna tell my 15-year-old self is
Mhm.
like, yo, kid, you're loved,
Mm.
right? Because I think like we were talking about how like I always felt like an outsider in certain friend groups,
Uh-huh.
even though I've been inside friend groups, right? And like how I felt like, yo, like even though like in relationships, like, hey, like I know you love me, but do you actually like love me, right?
Yeah.
So like once I identified that thing, right? Is it, hey, me is the next step, hey, me communicating that out like to everybody around me, like, yo, tell me you love me? Or is it, hey, you do have that inside of you, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
need the
Right.
external. Which one, like,
Yeah, well, it's funny because I just remembered this morning I saw a meme from it was like a wife sending it to her husband at 3 a.m. a text message saying, "Hey, do you love me?" And the husband responds, "I married you," right? And then she's like, "Yeah, but do you love me or do you just like me as a friend?" And it was like funny. It was a funny meme. But
mhm.
the thing is, the triggers that we have as kids, the wounds or the triggers, even if we like process them a little bit, sometimes they really don't always fully go away. But that awareness, right, of you saying, well, once I recognize it, what does that mean? I think it can be that level of like insight for yourself that, hey, if I feel really disconnected from this person, maybe it's because this core need of mine that now I have to have isn't being met. And maybe that means you do have a direct conversation with them and say, I need this. Or maybe it means that you just say, this is why I feel like this. It's not them, right? I ask my clients this a lot. Is this a you issue or a them issue? And we don't always want to admit when it's an us issue, a me issue, because it's so much easier to blame someone else and be like, they don't do this. I don't know if I answered your question
No,
essentially.
you did. No,
Okay.
you did because I'm thinking about this like live, like in a practical sense, right? Like
Mhm.
I'm trying to think like when you said like, is it a me issue or is it a you issue, right? Like I think like even though like knowing these things, like again, like you said, like it's very hard to take like that level of like accountability and say like,
Mm.
yo, like this is just like because I didn't get something when like it sounds like, and again,
Yeah.
maybe this is like again like
It's still
the
valid
brown
though.
male in me that doesn't want to admit like emotions, right? It just sounds like such like a soft like out, right? Like
Yeah.
back to what you're saying, like it's not like an excuse for those things, right? So like when I get
Yeah.
triggered by that, I'm all like, yo, like that's annoying that I feel that way, right? Like because of
Yeah.
something in my childhood, right? It just feels like
But let me
such
tell
a
you,
cop out, right?
yes, maybe I can see why you would feel like that. But here's the thing. Triggers are not necessarily the issue. It's how you manage the triggers. Are you reacting to it or are you responding to it? So if you feel this trigger, right, you can diminish it and minimize it and say, like, I'm just being petty, or why do I always have to make a big deal about this? Or you can say, you know what, I feel this. I don't have to voice it if I don't feel comfortable. But once you know it, then you can say, I'm not going to be reactive because I know that this is coming from my own insecurity versus what this person did. It's hard though.
Yeah, no, I hear you,
Yeah.
and I think like that's like the toughest part about all of this, right? Anytime somebody says it to me, like you're saying it to me, my therapist,
Hmm.
like it's so like it's like yo, like you're so right, right? But again, like in moments, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's probably the part that you're talking about, like the practice aspect of it all, right? It's
The
like in moment,
practice.
like it just sounds so rational. Like, even when like talking to my best friend, like sometimes I get annoyed about this, she's just like it's so rational. what you're
But
saying.
you know what? Earlier you said that like you had made an appointment with your therapist when you were in a crisis, and then, a month later when it was like kind of resolved, you were like, "Oh, I don't know if I need this." And I know you went, but like the thing is, these things can't be practiced in the middle of a trigger. Coping skills have to be practiced on a daily basis because if you can't regulate your emotions when things are not crazy, why would you be able to regulate them when they are crazy? Like why?
It's-
Right? So it sounds so silly and fluffy, but it starts with the small things. And for some people, it's like if you're very go, go, go and you're like quickly texting people, and I always say, okay, slow down. And I practice it in session with my clients. We'll do this like fake conversation where we're just like, oh my gosh, how is this? Blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, before you respond to me, you need to wait 3 seconds. And when you're counting 3 seconds, it actually seems like a lot. And this is for my
yeah.
clients who are like very impulsive and they'll just like be reactive really quickly. Or they're telling me a story about their roommate or their boyfriend or girlfriend. And they'll be like, okay, they said this and I am so annoyed that blah, 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 blah. And I'll say, okay, rephrase that, reframe it in your head and tell me, but take 5 seconds and think about it. And it always is so fascinating to watch them kind of like struggle with even waiting a few seconds. 5 seconds
Yeah.
is a lot, right? But it's not even the minimum requirement that you need to give your brain to process and be intentional, right? Because I know you hear me when I say responding is different than reacting, but it's a whole different, thing to put that into practice.
For sure. So, I feel like I could talk to you for like ever. I feel like I need to pay you for this therapy session. But really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah.
Like again, like this for you now after this complete open door. Like I would love to have you back on because
Oh,
I think that like people are really gonna like identify, and I know for me personally like this was super helpful, right? Because I think a lot of these things it's like nice hearing like
yeah.
a professional opinion, but also like validating some of like the concerns, some of the hey, like I am human and I am like figuring
Yeah.
that out, right? And I think a lot of us like, especially like our generation, like
Mhm.
feel that way, right? Like, hey, something is like wrong with us or something is off about us, right? Because if we probably tell our parents, like they're gonna be like, oh, what's wrong with you or something is off about you, and we just hear that and
Right.
like we like say like we then feel like internalize that and be like, yo, there is something
Absolutely.
wrong with me. And I think like it's like great to hear that like you're consistently reminding not just like your clients, but I'm sure like your friends and your family that like, hey, like you're a human, you have real emotions. Everybody has these
Yeah.
emotions.
We
And
all
it
have them. It's literally what connects us all.
yeah.
Thank you for having me and thank you
Absolutely.
for,
Thank you.
having these conversations on your
No,
platform.
absolutely. And again, like I really mean it. I would love to have you back on because
I
I
would
think
love to
like
be back.
there's so many other things that like I would love to like crush
I
through.
know.
But
And I'm so tangential that I was like, stay focused on the question because I can think of so many different directions to
no,
go
no,
with
that's how my
these. But
ADHD brain works too. But thank you all for listening and thank you so much again.
thank you.
Appreciate it. We good? Amazing.
Thank you. You are literally